All right, let's get started. We'll do the reminder. So, there's only one thing left for you to do. Final exam in this class a week from today at 7:15. Remember, open door policy, however, I have other finals scheduled. You're welcome to go to any of those. One more time. You could also go to a final on Tuesday next week at 9:25 in this room. Also, Tuesday, 11:35, 2 doors down, room 525. And then on Wednesday of next week, 1:45, it's on the other side of campus, room 370. Welcome to go to any of those. But if you go to any class that's not yours, make sure you do two things. First, you tell me which class you're from, especially if you go to that 11:35 class. That's a completely different class than this one. And second, when you turn in your final data link form, make sure you put on it your correct time of your class, 8 a.m., and remind me to go into a separate pile when you turn that in. With that, you're free to take it any place you want. Okay, any questions on that?
What was the 925 word?
Right here. Okay, so what we're going to do today is finish up some quick lecture stuff and then review for the final exam. Does somebody have a textbook I can borrow? A textbook. Cool, thanks. What I'm going to do after I get done doing this kind of lecture note stuff, I'm going to review what we've talked about previously. And then once we finish up the stuff on stratification, which will involve that review of welfare, I'm going to do a more abbreviated version and basically review 2 chapters I want you to be prepared for the final, and that's the chapter on gender and race. Okay, so could somebody get the lights there, and I will do the lights. A little better. Okay, so where were we last time? We were talking about poverty. What is poverty? It is an arbitrary line divided people who suffer from those who don't. The United States uses what's called an absolute measure of poverty. There are 2 ways of measuring poverty, absolute and relative. Absolute based upon some physical standard, usually some connection to food, because that's one of the easiest ways to see a physical connection to poverty. A relative standard is based upon your cultural standing. That is, are you outside the cultural mainstream such that people look down on you, and therefore you suffer social consequences? So, the U.S. poverty line is based, actually surprisingly, on an absolute measure, the price of food. Many years ago, there was a 1960s under Johnson, they created a minimally adequate food budget called the Thrifty Food Program. They then priced it, that is, they shopped it to see how expensive it was, and they multiplied that amount of money by 3, because in those days, 1/3 of the average American budget went for food, 1/3 went for housing, and 1/3 went for everything else. And that poverty line has been adjusted for inflation every year since. Currently, in the standard poor family in this country, remember, is a family of 3. So that's a little dated. That's 2012. It's now close to between $20,000 and $21,000 for a family of 3, because it's been adjusted for inflation for the last 3 years. So 2015, it's about $20,800, I think, is what it is for a family of 3. Yeah.
Is that chart going to be on the test then, or no?
I'm not going to test you. Is the poverty line 20,000, 20,110, 20,120? But you should know the poverty line in the U.S. is based on the price of food. It is therefore an absolute measure of poverty. That I will test you on. Okay. Currently, about 15% of the population lives beneath the poverty line. There are a lot of myths about poverty. Most Americans believe that most poor people are racial minorities. It's not true. The largest number of poor people are white, though it is true many racial minorities, not all, but many racial minorities are disproportionately poor. Only 1 out of 10 white people are poor, yet 1 out of 4 racial minorities are poor, yet the largest number of poor people are white for the simple reason that there are a lot of white people. And 10% of a large number turns out to be a plurality of all poor people. Then we talked about age and poverty. Who's most likely to be poor? Children. Key reasons: the elderly are no longer poor is the social program known as Social Security. That's important because it shows that we can do something about poverty. Another example of a country having done something about poverty: Sweden. All that has to do with power. Then we talked about how long people stay in power. This is also surprising to many people. Most people who experience poverty do it for a relatively short period of time. If you measure poverty longitudinally, that is, you look over a longer period of time than at any one moment, say you take a look over a 10-year period of time, and that's very common, we measure poverty. Anybody who's experienced poverty over 10 years, 2/3 of all those people will have experienced poverty for less than 3 years. So a relatively short period of time. What do you find most poor people? High concentrations of long-term poverty. And we're basically saying, by that last statistic on short-term poverty, there's 2 kinds of poverty: short-term and long-term. If you're looking for long-term poverty, you're going to find it in basically 2 places. Poor inner city communities in San Diego, Barrio Logan, but also rural areas. So also out in El Centro, out in the Central Valley of California, high concentrations of poverty in those areas. Short-term poverty, you're going to find the largest number of short-term poor people in working class suburbs. The reason for short-term poverty, remember, typically there's 3 reasons. 1, the business cycle. People get laid off, they're short-term poor. 2, birth of a child. Single mom working full-time in a minimum wage job, she is still going to be poor. And then 3, divorce for the same kinds of reasons. Talked about the image of welfare. They're on it forever. They're all teenagers. They're having huge numbers of kids. They're getting a huge amount of money. It's the largest percentage of federal spending. They're all racial minorities. And they wouldn't work unless you put a gun to their head, and they're all cheating. All right. Every single one of those stereotypes about welfare recipients are false, with the exception of cheating. No one in the United States who is receiving TANF, or in the old days, AFDC, is getting enough money to pull them above that poverty line. Nobody. Even if you add food stamps to that income, 3/4 of all people receiving those benefits are still not above the poverty line. So what does that mean? What are we talking about substance? Well, you're talking about less than $1,000 a month for a family of 3. Well, that's still way beneath the poverty line. Way beneath the poverty line. And if you add food stamps, that, okay, maybe $1,400. Still well beneath the poverty line for most people. Not a lot of money. They're not having a good time. 2, most of the women receiving these benefits are in their mid-20s, not their teens. 3, the number of kids they tend to have, 2. Length of time on welfare. Again, measured longitudinally, 3 years, which should sound familiar given what I just said, because the average stay in poverty is about 3 years. The largest number of recipients of welfare, what is their ethnicity? White Anglo. White Anglo. Again, measured longitudinally. And then finally, the one thing that is true, they cheat. But what's the most common form of cheating?
Not reporting income on the table.
Yeah, not reporting income and working on the table. What kind of work?
Lawn mowing,
No, not lawn mowing.
babysitting.
Babysitting, house cleaning. Babysitting and house cleaning, not reporting. Okay, that's all covered from last time, right? I'm looking for a shake of the head. No, you need more information. Okay, because that's fairly quick. You should know the difference between TANF and AFDC. AFDC is the old system of welfare. It stands for Aid to Family with Dependent Children. The current system is called Temporary Assistance to Needy Family, the abbreviation of which is TANF, usually pronounced TANF. In the old days, you could stay on welfare as long as you qualified, which basically meant you were poor and had a child. In the old days, you got more money for each additional child. In the old days, there was no requirement of work. That's changed since the introduction of TANF. Now, 5-year lifetime eligibility for welfare, as you don't get it forever. In many states, you don't get more money for an additional child you have. And the benefits here have been cut back. We had twice the number of people on welfare in 1996, before it was reformed, as we had during the Great Recession. And that's surprising. The Great Recession was the worst economics we've ever had since the Great Depression. Yet our welfare rolls during that period of time were still half of what they were in 1996, which was during a good time for the country economically. So, what's been the impact of TANF? If the problem was long-term welfare dependency, which many believed it was, the evidence didn't support that, but they believed that, and politicians respond to what most Americans want to see done, especially when it comes to unpopular groups like welfare recipients. They simply cut back welfare, and if getting people off of welfare is a measure of success, then that transition to TANF is the most successful policy change in the last 50 years. We cut the welfare rolls in half. On the other hand, did it reduce poverty? No, it didn't. It just changed the nature of it from the non-working poor, or at least the officially non-working poor, because they were working, they were just working under the table, to the officially working. Okay, that's all that stuff from last time. Any questions on any of that stuff I went through? I went through it fairly quickly. It will be on your final exam. Okay, let's talk a little bit about gender roles. And what I want to do now is just to basically go through the chapter. Chapter number 9 on gender inequality. Looking at some of the basic concepts. First, sociologists distinguish between what we call sex and gender. Sex and gender. Sex is the biological realities, your hormones, your secondary sexual traits, your little innies and outies. Gender, on the other hand, are the sets of behaviors we associate with being male and female. I mean, the book defines gender is the psychological, social, and cultural differences between males and females. In a word, to boil that down, gender is behavior, while sex is just that biological. You've got ovaries, you've got testes. Those are the biological differences. Now, what kinds of behaviors do we associate with them? Okay, today, Tyler, I'm going to ask, because we're short for time, only points of clarification.
What about like transgender? Because that's now becoming a big thing in our society.
Yeah, it is becoming a big thing. That is a socially defined category. And like gender itself, that's what we're talking about. The reality of sex is biology. There's two kinds, male, female, period. End of story when it comes to sex. Now, socially, this is all created with social input. So we now have transgender. We've got different versions of transgender, more male-defined or female-defined, gender defined. All that is a social construct that goes on top of that basic reality. Nature is simple: boy, girl. Boy, girl. Or hermaphrodite if you get a little complicated. But that's fairly biologically unusual. Okay, so what we get with those gender roles, with gender, is a set of interrelated behaviors called gender.